Mimarlık ve Çevre Tasarımı bölümüyüz ve birinci sınıflarla olan proje dersimizin bir konusu olarak şu anda bu seminerde bir aradayız. İsterseniz şöyle küçük bir İngilizce devam edeceğimiz için hem de yabancı öğrencilerimiz için de bir başlangıç olması amacıyla girişimizi yapalım. So, okay, good morning, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you all to this very special session of our course, Interior Design Studio 1 course. So today we have the honor of hosting one of Turkey's most distinguishing historians, actually, Professor Edhem Eldem. Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you, dear Professor, for accepting our invite. Well, this semester, as part of the final project of our design course, we decided to delve into the world of art and also history to find out some interesting conceptual ideas for our project, for our students' project. So now we expect our students to create conceptual ideas, utopias, by combining Osman Hamdi Bey's artistic vision, his paintings, and also with the history of Saida ancient city and the symbolic meanings of the Sarcophagi, if I pronounce well, unearthed during those excavations. So, well, we are incredibly fortunate today to have you, Professor Edhem Eldem, with us today to shed light on these fascinating subjects, drawing from his extensive knowledge and deep research. Well, thank you. We are eagerly looking forward to your talk. The floor is now yours. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, my honor.
Good.
Okay. So a couple of things about what I'm going to do. I'm a historian. I have little, if any, knowledge about interior design. And as a historian, I think I'm better at talking about dystopias than utopias. But then again, whatever works for you. So what I'm going to do is what I can do, which is basically tell you the story of the discovery of the necropolis of Saida, Sidon in Greek, Sidon or Saida, which you know is a city south of Lebanon, in a region that has been hardly hit by the war, the recent war between Israel and Hezbollah, which hopefully has now ceased with this ceasefire. So we're going to go back 150 years, more or less, to 1887, when the discovery was made. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you, so you won't have to see me, but you'll have me as an off voice behind the images. Let me see if... Okay. Yes. Okay. So that's the poster you designed for this talk. But I am going to look into what I call the story of the discovery of the sarcophagi in Sidon. So it's rather simple, and any of you who have visited the museum, the archaeological museums of Istanbul, would have probably seen some of the best examples of the sarcophagi that were extracted from the necropolis, the royal necropolis of Sidon. I have several examples here. On the left upper side, you have one of the most famous ones, which is the sarcophagus of Tabnit, a king of Sidon, a Phoenician individual who, as you can see, has recycled an Egyptian sarcophagus and inscribed it on its foot with Phoenician inscriptions, but has kept the original hieroglyphs. The other very famous sarcophagus that comes from, sorry, that comes from Sidon is the so-called Alexander sarcophagus. For some time, it was believed that this might have been the sarcophagus in which Alexander the Great was buried. We now know that it's not, and that it is probably the sarcophagus of one of his generals. In the middle, you have the sarcophagus called the so-called Lycian sarcophagus, which has a shape that reminds you of the Lycian tombs of southern Anatolia. On the upper right side, you have the sarcophagus of the wailers, or of the crying women, also very famous because of its representation of wailing, mourning women all around the sarcophagus. And on the bottom, you have a peek into the other sarcophagi, because there was a total of 21 that were extracted from there, next to Tabnit's sarcophagus, which gives you an idea of these uninscribed anthropoid sarcophagi that was discovered along the other ones. So it's a great variety. Some are heavily decorated and extremely large items. Some are smaller and more simple in their facture. Now, what's interesting about Sidon and the excavations at Sidon is that it brings together three major actors, or groups of actors, at three different levels. On the very left, to represent France, I've put a photograph of Ernest Renan. Ernest Renan is this famous French philosopher, historian, epigraphist, philologist, one of these typical figures of the 19th century, a very learned man who was especially interested in Phoenicia, what we call today Lebanon, in Phoenician, the language, and of course in the biblical lands, that is, biblical history. He is the author of one of the bestsellers of the 1860s in France, which is La vie de Jésus, that is, the life of Jesus. What is exceptional about this book, and was a scandal at the time, is that it was an attempt at treating Jesus as a human being and not as the Son of God. So it was a historicization of a banalization, if you want, of the life of Jesus, and it was an attempt at using anthropology and philology to try to reconstruct the historical context of 2,000 years earlier. In the middle, you have the Ottoman dimension, represented by, guess who? Osman Hamdi Bey, who in the 1880s, in 1881, had become the director of the Imperial Museum. So in this photograph, you see him in a very typical bureaucratic pose. It's what we call in Turkish el pençe divan. It's a pose that Ottoman bureaucrats very often used in photography in order to show their submission and their respect to the system, and especially to the Sultan at the time, Abdülhamid II. And on the right, you have the local dimension. Local in the sense of Beirut, Saida, or Lebanon in general, represented by one of these very ambiguous characters, Edouard Durigello. Durigello, as you can hear from the name, is of Italian origins. He is what people generally call a Levantine, that is, an Italianate Catholic who has settled, whose family has settled in the Levant, that is, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and whose specialty, the Durigello brothers, there are three of them, is basically the smuggling and the trafficking of antiquities. So three dimensions: Western science, Ottoman museology and the Ottoman state, and at the right, local, let's say, fraudulous trafficking in antiquities. And this will give you a sense of the people the number of people involved in all that is happening in Sidon from the 1850s on. Again, on the left, the French, starting with Ernest Renan, who already in the 1850s was present in Sidon and in Beirut and started studying Phoenician antiquities. Aimé de Péretier, Robert de Petiteville, Comte de Pertuis, Comte de Sarcey. These are all French diplomats, consuls in Lebanon, who were all involved, of course, in the extraction of antiquities and providing their government, and especially the Louvre Museum, with antiquities. This to show you that the borders between archaeology, science, and diplomacy, politics, is a very blurred border. It's a very, very fluid world. In the middle, we have the Ottomans. The Ottomans represented, of course, by Osman Hamdi Bey as the director of the museum, Aristide Baltazzi, who is a Greek Ottoman citizen and one of the deputies of Osman Hamdi Bey, a very rich local Greek family from the region of Aliya near Izmir, who is fascinated by antiquities and therefore works bona fide and pro bono in most cases for the museum. Beshara Deb is the engineer of the province of Lebanon, Vilayet Mühendisi, a very important figure, people who are supposed to contribute through technology, through science, to the needs of the province. But of course, anything that involves excavations or getting something from, extracting something from under the surface of the earth is also something that involves the action and the help of an engineer. So Beshara Deb, who is a local Lebanese Maronite Christian, is an Ottoman subject, is one of the key figures on the Ottoman side. And then Theodoros Makridis, who is again Ottoman and Greek, works at the Imperial Museum, will enter the museum later, but will be one of the major excavators of Sidon at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1900s. And on the right, the local dimension, which is already partly represented by Beshara Deb, but also by, as I said, the Durigello brothers, but also by local powerful families like the Sursok, who are still one of the most prominent families, Christian families of Lebanon, but also important Druze families, Durzi families, such as the Jumblats. The Jumblats are still very, very active in the region, and the Arslan, who are also Druzes, who play a role in the extraction and the trafficking of these objects. So Hamdi goes to Saida, and we have to understand that Hamdi is at the beginning of his career as the director of the museum. I use this photograph because I like it a lot, because I think it speaks highly of Hamdi. This is 1883 when he surveys the famous tumulus of Antiochos on top of Nemrutda. And I like the photograph because I think we can read his mind when he poses on top of this statue, of this colossal head of a statue. He is basically saying, I have conquered. I have conquered this for my museum, for my empire. It's like conquering land in a sense, and especially because he's conquering it from foreign powers, from foreign archaeologists, especially the Germans, who had discovered the site the previous year. So this arrogance, this attitude of, I own this place is very typical of Osman Hamdi's mind and of the high idea he had, the high opinion he had of his role at the head of the museum. You probably know that he is also the author, or at least the man behind, the 1884 regulation or bylaw uh, on antiquities. That is what is called in Turkish the Asar Atika Nizamnamesi, which was published in 1884, and which basically says that foreigners need a permission to excavate in the Ottoman lands, and they cannot take a single object out of the country. This is a major challenge to the authority of Western archaeology. This is Hamdi saying, I am your equal, my museum is as good as yours, and therefore you will not be allowed to take away objects from the soil of the Ottoman Empire, as you have for decades, because they have to remain in the country, they have to remain in my museum, and if you want to study them, come to my museum. The doors are open, but there's no way you can take them away. Interestingly, and that is why you have a second document on the right side, the 1884 bylaw on antiquities, the Ottoman bylaw, is to a large extent inspired by the 1834 Greek law on antiquities, with a major difference, which is that the Greek law speaks of the antiquities, the heritage that was left by our Hellenic forefathers, the ancestors, whereas the Ottoman bylaw cannot speak of forefathers and speaks only of peoples who lived on the Ottoman lands before, in the past, which is one of the major problems of Ottoman archaeology, but also of Turkish archaeology today. The fact that the average citizen in Turkey still sees no connection between his or her identity and anything that is pre-Islamic or non-Turkish. We'll come back to that during questions if necessary. So Renan is one of the first scientists in the West to react to the 1884 bylaw. He reacts very violently. Here is what he says in a report to the French government. He calls this bylaw a sad proof of the childish views of the Turkish government or on scientific matters. And he says that this bylaw will be remembered as a dark moment in the history of the search for antiquities. So what he says basically is that these are Orientals, these are Turks, these are whatever you want to call them, Muslims. These are not legitimate heirs to the antiquities that are discovered in the lands they possess, in the lands over which they rule. And therefore, they should relinquish, they should leave to Westerners the real, the genuine, the legitimate heirs of this heritage, the right to excavate, the right to extract, and the right to use for the good of science these objects by studying them, publishing them. So he is basically saying that these Orientals have no business meddling with what is our monopoly, our prerogative. And that's precisely what Hamdi is trying to counter. Hamdi is saying, no way. I can show you, I can prove that we are as legitimate users of these antiquities, and I can prove it by showing the quality of my collections and the quality of my museum. And that is why the discovery in 1887 of this necropolis is of crucial importance for Hamdi, because it's the first major discovery only 3 years after this bylaw and 6 years after his coming to the management of the museum, is the first serious discovery that is going to enrich his collections and is going to give him the opportunity to publicize, to show off, in a sense, his museum as a deserving institution, an institution that deserves, that merits the respect and the recognition of the Western world. So how does it happen? It happens in the beginning of 1887, in February, when the Kaimakam, that is the district governor of Saida, writes to the government, to the Sublime Porte, to Baba Ali, saying, reporting on a discovery that was made of sarcophagi. They haven't discovered them all, but at least there are two that are visible, and here is the description that he makes of it. A coffin made of the purest marble, the end of its lid, decorated with a crown, and all four sides with sculptures 50 centimeter high, representing very beautiful girls. They use the word because it's, you know, what we wouldn't do today, standing with an expression of sadness, of grief. So we understand that what he's describing is precisely the sarcophagus of the wailing women I showed you at the very beginning. You can see that the description is extremely coarse. It's a very simple description. He is really describing what he sees, because the Kaimakam has no proper education in archaeology or in classics or whatever. He's just telling you what he sees. All he can identify here is a sanduka, that is a coffin, because he sees immediately that this is obviously something that is used to bury a body. But apart from that, he cannot give any further explanation about what this is. And then he talks of a second sarcophagus, and he says, when summoned, the chief engineer Beshara Efendi declared that the ancient sarcophagi discovered consisted each of two parts with the lid, and that the heaviest, measuring 3.2 meters in length, 170 in width, and 130 in height, reached a net weight of 14 tons. So you can see the combination of the discourse of a bureaucrat who is reporting and of an engineer, because an engineer is not an archaeologist either. What an engineer can do is estimate the weight of an object and measure it. And from these measurements, it is clear that what he is describing is the sarcophagus, so-called, of Alexander, the so-called Alexander sarcophagus, one of the most beautiful Hellenistic objects we know, and what will become the major item in the collection of the archaeological museum in Istanbul, or the Imperial Museum. Now, Hamdi, when he publishes this discovery in 1892, 5 years after the discovery, will give a summary of the way in which everything happened. So he says, this is a translation from the French, it was after receiving the report by Beshara Effendi that His Imperial Majesty the Sultan, whose solicitude for his museum is so great, entrusted me with the mission to go to Saida in order to extract the precious monuments that had just been discovered, to have them transported on a state ship to Constantinople, and to engage, if necessary, in other excavations in the same location. You will see immediately that this is, of course, an effort by Hamdi Bey to give some kind of a very summary, a very synoptic description of what happened, but giving Abdul Hamid a role of benefactor of sciences. This is sycophancy. I mean, it's a typical example of what we would call today yağlama yıkama, or yalakalık, very typical of the Hamidian period, but not only of the Hamidian period. When you look at the Turkish past and present, this idea that everything happens thanks to Abdülhamid, right? It's their way of surviving in an autocratic system. So, but you do see that, yes, he needs the support of the Sultan. He needs to have a mission that is paid for, and he needs to have the means of the empire, especially a ship, to have the sarcophagi brought back to Istanbul. So, at the same time, it's interesting to note that the French consul, Petite Ville, in Beirut, is writing back to his government and reporting on the ambiguity of Bishar Edhem's position. What he says is Bishar Edhem is conscious of the Turks' incompetence in archaeology, and if one were to push him a little bit, one would find in him an expression of regret at seeing the treasures of ancient art falling into the hands of the infidels. The subtext is very clear. The French is confirming his own Orientalism, the fact that these Ottomans, they don't know anything about archaeology, but he's also adding this as an attitude of the local Christians. He's saying that Bishar Edhem is likely to be much more loyal to us French than to the Ottomans, because he too shares our view that the Ottomans are incapable of making a proper use of these objects, of these archaeological finds. This is, you know, a typical example of the Orientalist context that characterizes archaeology in the Ottoman Empire at that time. So Osman Hamdi, once he arrives, immediately, as a good bureaucrat, writes back to the government, to the Ministry of Public Instruction, and says, once I arrived at Saida, I immediately examined the discoveries. In your servants' kulları opinion, these objects are of a beauty and rarity unequaled by the museums of Europe, and I observed with joy that just one of these objects would be sufficient to place the museum that holds it among the richest in the world. Now, this is interesting because even before the extraction of the sarcophagi, you can read Osman Hamdi's plan. He has a plan. Osman Hamdi is not an archaeologist. He's not a philologist. He's not a historian. He's a museum director who was catapulted at the head of the museum because he had a French education, because he was an artist, because he was a cultivated man. But that's all. That doesn't make him a specialist of archaeology. But he has one thing for him, retrospectively. He's a genius of communication and public relations. And this is what will enable him to carry his museum to some kind of an international recognition and fame in ways that were unthinkable before. And this you can see already at the end of April 1887, because he sees these objects not as an archaeological discovery, but as something that is going to promote the visibility of and the reputation of his museum. He knows that a museum is as good as the objects it holds. He knows that the Louvre is all about the paintings and the Venus de Milo. He knows that the British Museum is all about the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon marbles. He knows that that is what makes a museum internationally famed. And he sees, he senses already, without having a proper education in archaeology, that the wealth and the beauty of the objects he's found is going to be useful for the reputation and the promotion of his project. So he immediately also well, immediately. In the publication of 1892, he makes sure to acknowledge the contribution of Western science to his own endeavor. This is also very typical of him. He knows how to play a balancing act between opposing the ambition and the greed of Western scientists, but at the same time, recognizing their worth and integrating them, appeasing them in order to communicate in a better way with them. So in 1892, when he publishes this discovery with Theodore Reinach, he he refers immediately to Ernest Renan, the guy who was so against his bylaw. He refers to him as a source of inspiration to guide me in this description as well as in the work itself. I had an excellent guide. I am speaking of Monsieur Ernest Renan, who has preceded us in these lands where he has excavated. It is in his work that we have found precious information and advice, etc. So he's making sure that he is satisfying both the West and his own ambitions to create a museum and a locus of archaeology in the Ottoman lands. So geographically, topographically, what is it that happens? This is a map of Saida at the time, basically, of the discovery, a little bit earlier, 1864, but it gives you an idea of what it looked like. In pink, you have the town of Saida with its harbor, and you can see here a place named Aya. Aya is the place where the sarcophagi will be discovered. It's a field, and this is the detail. If we zoom in, this is the detail of Aya as mapped in the 1892 publication of Hamdi. And you can see here the trenches that were dug in order to access the necropolis. Here's the necropolis. If you zoom in a little more, you can see all the underground hypogea, the necropolis, the burial ground that was discovered in 1887. Images that were published in 1892 give you a better sense of how the operation was carried out. You can see that there was, here you can see on the left, the detail of the excavation itself and the intricate, multi-layered positioning of the necropolis. And on the right, you can see scenes from the extraction with the use, and that's where Beshar Edhem is useful, obviously, with some kind of a track that is laid in order to have the sarcophagi. You remember that they're tons, they weigh tons, to have the sarcophagi slide from the necropolis down to the port, because that is where they will be loaded on a ship. So yet another scene of the workers participating in this extraction. And here is a vision of, again, the sarcophagi of the wailing women exposed outside of the necropolis before it is slided down the tracks to the seashore. So there you have the description of the journey from Aya to the ship. Number 5 is the ship that is waiting. The harbor is so small that the ship that was sent by the government cannot enter, so they have to find a way to transport the sarcophagi after bringing them on tracks down to the seashore. Here they build some kind of a pier, and from the pier they will move them to the ship, loading them on some kind of a raft. This is an aerial photograph of the 1920s or 1930s that shows Saida, and where I have traced the itinerary followed by the sarcophagi from Aya down to the shore and from the pier to the ship. And here is a view of the pier that was built in order to accommodate the raft, and the raft would take the sarcophagi to the ship. A very interesting document. We know, and I told you earlier, that Hamdi bears no grudges against Renan. He's, on the contrary, conscious that he has to involve Renan in this project in order to gain recognition and legitimacy in the Western world. So immediately after the discovery of the sarcophagi, and especially of the sarcophagus of Tabnit with the Phoenician inscription, he sends to Renan a copy of that inscription, a print from that inscription, in order to ask for his help in deciphering, in reading this inscription. This is the best way, if you know the character of a very arrogant man like Ernest Renan, this is the best way to get his support by recognizing his expertise, asking him for help, and he gets this telegram that is sent back to him with Renan's translation of the inscription and his congratulations for the recognition. So by this very astute move, Hamdi has been able to conquer, in a sense, Renan, and to force him to recognize him as a legitimate interlocutor, as a peer. This is part of Hamdi's very, very intelligent public relations campaign. There's an interesting detail that really, again, shows the Osman Hamdi's character. I've discovered a copy of Renan's, I mentioned at the beginning, Vie de Jésus, The Life of Jesus, his best-selling book from 1863, a copy that belonged to Hamdi. And in this copy, there's a passage, page 213, 213, where Renan talks of a stone inscription in Jerusalem that has been placed in order to ban non-Jews from entering the grounds of the temple. A small detail. But if you can see here, there is in the margin an inscription, a scribbling in with a pencil, and it is signed by Hamdi. This is Hamdi responding to Renan in one of Renan's books, and he says, "The stone bearing this inscription is in the Museum of Constantinople since 1887." So he brought it back with him from his travels to Lebanon. It is I who had it transported there. So this is Hamdi claiming his territory. He's saying, look, this guy is talking, you, Renan, are talking about an object. I went to Jerusalem and I grabbed this object and I brought it back with me and I put it in my museum. It's his way of claiming admission into the club, if you want, of the archaeologists and scientists of the time. So when you look at the year 1887, you can see how much Osman Hamdi is obsessed and busy with the sarcophagi. He writes to Karl Humann, his German friend, and says, I am very busy with the temporary installation of all these sarcophagi. Remember, this is not just about the sarcophagi. It is about the museum. And he says, I'm busy with the installation and with the construction of an annex, a new building to the museum, for which I have just received a decree from the Sultan. This building will consist of a huge hall, very beautiful, and exclusively devoted to the sarcophagi, the number of which keeps growing. So what he's saying is, I'm going to build a new museum around these sarcophagi. This is how important they are to me. This is how crucial they are to me in order to plan ahead and to start thinking of an enlargement of the museum to meet the requirements of modernity. Because until then, the museum consists mainly of Çinili the tiled pavilion, a 15th century building where all the stuff that had been collected was kind of lumped without any systematic ordering or cataloging. He wants to have a new and modern museum. And again, you can see how important some of the objects, some of the sarcophagi are in trying to promote this project, especially the Alexander sarcophagus. The Alexander sarcophagus, because Alexander, if you say Alexander, and if you start spreading the news that the sarcophagus of Alexander has been discovered, you're going to get a lot of attention throughout the world. And Osman Hamdi is very careful in doing this because he knows already that it's probably not Alexander's sarcophagus. And yet, he allows for this rumor to spread because he knows it's good for his museum. It's good publicity. So, as you can see in this letter to Konze, to Karl Humann, where he talks about Konze, because Konze, the German archaeologist, has apparently written to Hamdi saying, you should not say that this is the Alexander sarcophagus, because it's not. But he's writing to Humann. He says, I'm not the one saying it is. It's a certain Carabella who did so and who spread the rumors in the news, in the newspapers. So he's basically playing dumb in order to get the attention of the world without being responsible for spreading false rumors. And indeed, yes, this Titus Carabella has published in the British press a short article where he says, this is the tomb of Alexander the Great. Just as Galileo repeated, e pur si muove, and I can say nothing but these words, that this is the tomb of Alexander. So somebody else, maybe with Osman Hamdi's blessing, is spreading the news of this being Alexander's sarcophagus. And even the famed archaeologist Charles Wallstein will publish an article in the Times where he says, you know, it may not be Alexander's tomb, but I feel that Osman Hamdi would be justified in pointing to the possibility of this being the case. And he says that he believes that except the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, and the Hermes of Praxiteles, no work of ancient Greek art has been found of greater artistic interest and value. There's no better publicity for Hamdi than this. And he's going to use it. He's going to show the sarcophagus, play, he's going to invest in a publicity campaign, in a sense, not only to conquer the attention of the West, but also to legitimize his project in the eyes of local institutions, the palace and the Ottoman public administration, public debt administration, because he needs money. He needs money to build his museum. And he gets this money. He gets it mostly from the public debt, the duyun umumiye, but he gets it, of course, with the blessing of the Sultan. Because the Sultan, although Abdulhamid has nothing to do with archaeology, is conscious that this is good publicity. It's part of this desire to show the empire under the light of modernity and civilization. And this is what the museum looks like. The museum is opened in 1891. So it is a museum that basically imitates the model of European museums in London, in Paris, very classical. But as you can see, there are only 2 rooms. This is what he said to Karl Humann. 2 rooms with only the objects that were brought from Saida, the sarcophagi. So it is the Museum of Sarcophagi. It is Luhud Atika Musese, Luhud Lahit, plural, Atika, old. It's the Museum of Ancient Sarcophagi. And when you compare it to the present state of the Imperial Museum, you can see that this is only the nucleus of what will become, with the extensions of 1903 and 1906, will become the museum as we know it today. So in red, you have this central nucleus that was created in 1891, and to the left and the right, you have the extensions of 1903, 1906, which were made possible once Osman Hamdi obtained this reputation for his museum and himself of having built a proper institution of knowledge in Istanbul. So this is a view of the museum today, and you can see on the right, Çinili Köşk, the famous tiled pavilion, and right across from it, the central part of the museum, which is the first building that was built in 1891. And you can see that it is in the purest neoclassical style, with elements that have been borrowed from the decorative elements of the sarcophagi themselves. Even the catalogue of the museum, when it is published in the 1890s, will use the Lycian sarcophagus as some kind of an image to decorate the cover of both the French and the Turkish versions of the sarcophagus. So that's how central these objects are to the identity of the museum. So as I told you, Hamdi is basically building a ground for the legitimacy of his museum. This is a long letter he writes to Karl Humann in 1887. We don't have to read all of it, but basically what he says is what I told you earlier. He says, okay, you Germans, you French, you British, you have looted our lands for years and for years, and now I have put a stop to it with my bylaw. But that does not mean that you will not be able to benefit from the scientific knowledge that can be extracted from these objects, because all I'm asking is that you leave them in the country, and I will put them in my museum, and I will prove to you that, after all, Istanbul, with its museum, is as good a location as London, Berlin, or Paris to do science, to do archaeology, to study antiquities. So he's claiming, in a sense, his share of the recognition of the public domain that is defined by science and archaeology in the late 19th century. And there are some passages in the 1892 publication that describes the discovery of 1887. There are passages where you can see how he's trying to enlighten the West about the complexity of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire. He says, for example, it would be a mistake to believe that this work of destruction is due, as many like to repeat, to the fanaticism of the natives, because that's the Western argument. The Western argument is that, oh, these savages, all they know is to destroy these antiquities because they don't understand their worth, and they deface them because they have representations of the human body, and that is a no-no in Islam. No, says he, the real cause is the venality and ignorance of the lower classes of the population, both Muslim and Christian. So he says it's a social problem, constantly triggered by a few foreigners established in this country with no other goal than to engage in a wide trafficking of antiquities. So he's pointing fingers at the West and at the agents of the West, those who are poaching antiquities in the Ottoman lands in order to sell them to Western collectors and to Western museums. And he says it would be useless to give names here, for there's not one tourist, not one archaeologist among those who have visited Syria in the past 25 years who do not know who they really are. So he's talking about the Durigellos. He's not naming them, but he's saying, look, you have created a black market of antiquities because of your greed to obtain these objects, and you are still accusing the people for destroying this antiquity, whereas the real responsible is you and the monsters you have created by putting so much pressure on antiquities at a local level, and therefore creating a black market for these antiquities. So this is the publication, the famous publication of 1887. It's basically text and images. You can see the text is a smaller volume. The images are a large volume. The text is about a description of what's what, how it was, the sarcophagi were carried, what was discovered in it, including the skeleton and cranium of Tabnit, for example, and the plates, that is, the images, are absolutely beautiful because they have been designed to render what was one of the most extraordinary features of the so-called Alexander sarcophagus, the fact that it had still traces of polychromy, that is, traces of coloring on it. So these plates are luxurious plates that have been designed by an artist in Istanbul to render the beauty of the sculpture, but also of the images. You can see the beauty of the detail of each of the faces on this sarcophagus. So it's one of the most expensive publications in archaeology, but a very successful one because it brings again to the attention of the wider world the treasures of the Constantinople Imperial Museum. And still today, the Iskender Lahti, the sarcophagus of Alexander, is one of the main attractions of the Archaeological Museum of Istanbul. And you may notice that the way it is called by the museum is generally the Alexander sarcophagus, Iskender Lahti. So the museum is doing the same as Hamdi, that is, not disclosing the fact that this is probably not Alexander's sarcophagus, using, in a sense, the attraction of Alexander to legitimize and to draw attention to this object. Now, the last thing I want to do is comment on two paintings by Osman Hamdi, who were wrongly identified as being from Iraq, but in fact are from Saida. And these paintings, I've been able, by comparing them with photographs, to identify exactly where they were taken from. So that's one of the paintings. It's a landscape by the sea with what seems to be a minaret and some houses. This is another version of the same scene, again by Hamdi, and you can recognize the same buildings. And here are photographs from the 1870s, 1880s by Bonfils, a photographer, a Jewish photographer of the region, that seem to correspond to what is described on the paintings. Here you can see this minaret with a square base, which is probably the minaret that was painted by Hamdi. And you can see how similar these two buildings are on the photograph and the painting. And there's also, by the same photographer, this landscape of Saida from the sea. And if you zoom in to that area of the photograph, there you have it. And if you compare it to the painting by Hamdi, it seems that you can, through the windows, identify exactly what buildings he had painted from the shore, of Saida, to create these two landscapes of Saida. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you. I'm worried that the only image I can see is me. So I don't know. And now I have an echo of my voice.
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Could you follow the whole thing?
Yes, everything was perfect. Thank you, Professor.
Was it in the studio too?
I think the voice goes a little bit.
Can hear
Oh,
you.
okay, good.
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us for this very inspiring presentation, Professor, that has enriched really our understanding of this extraordinary intersection of history, of art, and archaeology. So I believe this information will shape a very meaningful path for our students' projects. Well, if there are any questions from our students, maybe we can start with that, or I can ask a question. Happily and luckily, I could be the first one. How is it going in the studio? Are there any questions, Ekin Hocam? Well, maybe until the voice goes there, I can start with my question. I think they will hear it later after. So, Professor, my question is about the sarcophagi. Well, considering the symbolic richness of the Saida sarcophagi, what advice would you give to our students on how to translate such historical and symbolic depth into kind of modern design concepts for their utopian or dystopian projects? I would like to ask, are there any particular themes or elements that you think from Osman Hamdi Bey's legacy that you believe could guide them in creating meaningful designs? That's my question.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I have any advice to give in terms of design, but I think there are some issues that might be worth exploring. First of all, and you know, people are not going to like what I say. But you probably know that Turkey is constantly asking for the restitution and return of objects that have been looted from Turkish territory. What about these objects that were taken from what is now Lebanon? You know, mal sahibi, mülk sahibi, hani bunun ilk sahibi, as they say, right? So I'm not saying that I have a position in this, but I'm saying that as a country that claims restitution, but has had an empire in the past, which extended over lands that have gained their independence, are we still entitled to holding these objects because we had them then, because we could take them then? I don't know. I mean, that's one thing that needs to be explored. The second is more generally the idea of, you know, is it a good idea? Is the museum a good idea when you think that the museum is basically about destroying the integrity of a site in order to enrich its collections? So independently of where it was found or the status of that land today, the soil itself, you know, is it not, and this has to do with practically every museum under the sun. I mean, it's the Egyptian sarcophagi in London, in Paris, in Berlin. It's anything you can imagine that has been moved away from its original place in order to be shared with millions, supposedly, in centrally located museums. Because this is something that we don't do anymore. I mean, Ephesus has its museum. Antioch has its museum. So the localization of objects is something we try to do today, but most of the museums that are, most of the powerful museums, the museums that have grown in the 19th century and the 20th century, have done exactly the contrary. That is, deplete the provinces, deplete the periphery in order to enrich the center. So that, I think, is something that may be reflected on. The third point I'd like to make is that this necropolis is very interesting because of its eclectic nature. It's very eclectic in the sense that you have Hellenistic, Roman, Phoenician, Lycian, Egyptian styles that have been lumped together in a royal necropolis that has accumulated the sarcophagi over generations. And what I said, for example, about the sarcophagus of Tabnit being actually a recycled Egyptian sarcophagus is very interesting because it gives us a vision of something that archaeology, in fact, hates, which is reuse and layering. You know, the principle in archaeology is that you want to cleanse all the sites of later constructions. That's what they did to the Parthenon. The Parthenon had in the middle of the Acropolis, the Parthenon had in its middle a mosque, which originally was built as a church, a medieval church. But the principle of archaeology in the 19th century being that of returning to the purest expression of art and civilization, they have destroyed everything that was built after the date of construction of the Parthenon. So it's understandable because you are returning to the original. But history doesn't work that way. And these sarcophagi prove that history is about mixing and matching and recycling and reusing and spoliating. And that is a very interesting dimension, which archaeology may find difficult to deal with because of its obsession with reaching the original object. But it's fascinating to historians because historians are the first to claim that history is a process. It's not frozen in time, it's a process. So these are the 3 points I would think as a historian might be of interest. I don't know to what extent it might be useful for your studio, but this is what comes to my mind.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really interesting to delve into these layers of cultural context. So for our students, even to learn how the layers are coming together and to learn more about their meanings, their symbolic meanings will be highly important to create something unique and meaningful at the same time. So thank you for your answer. And are there any questions from the studio or from you?
For us, no. That's not now.
Our students were taking notes, but they don't have questions right now. I'm sure they will watch the whole presentation again. We appreciate the presentation. It was really interesting for all of us.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. It was fun to do, and apparently the presentation was so clear that there are no questions, right? I'm kidding. Okay, sure. If you have questions later, you can write to me. But it was a pleasure to, although you're completely frozen, I have to say. I mean,
Well, yeah, it's a really pleasure to meet you, Professor. And if you're interested, we will be very happy to share the final results of our student project.
Sure, I'd be curious to see. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, in the end of the semester, we will send
Sure.
you a range of projects. All right.
Sure.
Very nice to meet you. Hope to
Thank
see you
you.
again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your time.
Take care. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too.